UConn and here at the Coop, and I'm going to read some of the book tonight, a little bit about stores. I'll take any questions that you have. I would like to invite you all over to the Nathan Hale Inn when this is over. We're going to have a good party there. It's only a few minutes walk, and I just look forward to catching up with as many of you as I can. So thanks again for coming. I thought, it's funny, the last time I was here I was trying to decide what to read, and for some crazy reason I didn't read much about stores. I read about Hartford, and then I realized later, there was some stuff that really needed to be read, and I didn't quite get around to it. So tonight I'm going to catch up on that, and I'm going to read a little bit about stores and then a little bit about the campus restaurant, which has been the subject of considerable internet attention lately. In any event, this is from Parallel Play. I should add that they gave it the subtitle Growing Up with Undiagnosed Asperger's, which is part of the story, but not remotely all the story. It is now off on this reissue, so I recommend that you buy the reissue rather than the original one, because I hate that subtitle. In any event, here's a little attempt at trying to sum up stores as it was maybe 35, 40 years ago. And I start with the fact that my dad did what used to be done at universities. Some of you I know knew my dad here. He basically started at one school, then kind of pulled up to another school, and then another school, and always got a slightly better job, better position, and we ended up at stores in 1962, and this is a little bit about that. My father's zigzag pursuit of tenure had pulled him from Michigan to a deanship in Denton, Texas, and when I was 7 to a full professorship at the University of Connecticut in stores, forever my hometown and the setting for most of the rest of this story. Northeastern Connecticut residents take a slightly defensive pride in the area. This is not the suburban Connecticut of the coastal cities and towns, built with New York wealth and packed with commuters and yachts. Nor is it the storybook Connecticut of the Berkshires, with its majestic homes, historical plaques, and manicured village greens. Northeastern Connecticut has its own sober beauty, made up of brambles, stones, low hills, and bleary skies, a beauty most apparent on monochromatic afternoons in deep winter, when the snow is hardened on the ground, dusk sets in by 4, and a crack of winter light shines through the woods, accompanied by the rattle of distant buzzsaws. Stores compressed the world into 2 or 3 miles. There was a single grocery store, a movie theater that received box office hits a year late, a record and radio shop, my favorite, an unusually fine concert series, the comparatively big city of Hartford to visit once or twice a year, and a handful of people whom I determined I would know forever. My mother, accustomed to California sunshine and sophisticated window shopping, took a long time to get used to stores. My father was oblivious to location as long as he could pursue his work. For my brother and sister, it was simply a good place to grow up. I still visit whenever possible, for there's no other place I can ever know in such intimate details its genealogy, its pathways, its history, and its legends. Legends. What better place to start than the structure on the northwest corner of Route 195 and Birchwood Heights, a peculiar monument to fraternal hatred. Sprawling and uncared for, the proverbial haunted house, it had been left to brothers who despised each other, but they continued to live there, dividing their legacy precisely in half, painting exterior sections in clashing shades of blue, even arranging the shingles so as to run in different directions, all the time refusing any manner of social contact. Eventually they both died, and the house stood vacant for many years before it was torn down in the late 60s. The last time I passed by, nothing had been built in its stead. Then there was a man who had been driving with his much-loved wife, and somehow there had been an accident and she was killed. From that day on, or so we were told, he swore he would never ride again in a car, and we would regularly see him walking from his home in Mansfield Center, 3 or 4 miles to Willimantic, his face a fixed mask of astonished, unreachable pain. Everybody in town knew the lore. Still, in snow or stormy weather, locals would pull over and offer him a ride. And he perpetually refused, sometimes quite brusquely, and continued his solitary penance, growing ever more stooped with the years until he vanished altogether. The nearest town of any size, Willimantic, was kind of a tough place then, and there was nobody tougher than Frank G., who led a local motorcycle gang. Frank met a remarkable end. Along with one of his droobs, he had kidnapped a young woman, forced her a few hundred feet from the road, and raped her repeatedly. Her cries attracted the attention of a rescue team, and Frank was soon fleeing through the woods, of which there were then a great deal. Meanwhile, a resident of neighboring Chaplin seemed to be having a rough day. He had been phoning the police all morning, insisting that men from Mars were preparing to land on his roof, and that he intended to shoot as many as he could before they dragged him away. Right at that moment, Frank G., panting hard and believing he had escaped, darted out of the forest and into the wrong backyard, where he came face to face with karma. This is only a sampling of the tales still relayed late at night in local bars, usually followed by a shake of the head and some morsel of homegrown philosophy, such as, "Only in stores, man." For a time in my 20s, after my parents moved away and I had settled in New York, I subscribed to the Willimantic Chronicle, your hometown newspaper since 1877, which I'd read since childhood. There was a lag of 3 or 4 days before the paper arrived in the mailbox, and Manhattan delivery was priced at a then exorbitant $77 for a year's subscription, but the investment was well worth it. I did not choose the Chronicle for its coverage of world affairs, which editors invariably cribbed from the wire services. It was the local news, the stories no other paper printed, that I cared about, for the Chronicle kept me in touch, however vicariously, with the people and the landscape that I had then known for more than a quarter century. I would speed under Midtown on the IRT subway, my thoughts 120 miles away, as I read about stores in the Chronicle. I might be touched by a photograph of a brownie troop, by the identical eyes in one young girl that I had once loved in her mother. I would be saddened by the obituary of a beloved teacher, not surprised by the arrest of a former nemesis, upset that the antique neon sign at the grocery, 1 or 2 years away from the stature of a classic, had been unceremoniously demolished, and amused that the trailer park where I once lived in impoverished splendor had been razed and replaced by spiffy condominiums. When I last returned, I picked up a copy of the Chronicle, and it was as though the clocks had stopped. The front page featured a picture of a tin bucket and suckling spigot on a weathered tree, harvesting the seasonal supply of maple syrup. In the background was a long stone wall laced with the rusty barbed wire that has run through stores since the 19th century. I reflected that I once knew that wall by heart, knew exactly which rocks would support the full weight of a sprinting child as I dashed down to the brook with my brother Rick. And I realized that mine was, in many ways, a classic New England boyhood, of the sort believed extinct even then, complete with swimming holes and Saturday morning tobogganing on a slope called Horse Barn Hill. Occasionally I wander through the cemetery high above North Eagleville Road and recognize all the original town names: Thompson, Oldershaw, Stearns, and of course Stores. The college had been constructed on family land. Every time I visit the graveyard, I come across somebody else whom I once knew, most recently the friendly lady with the shadow of a mustache who collected our lunch tickets at Storrs Grammar School. And I am old enough to put actual faces to the names on the campus buildings: Jorgensen, Gentry, Gant, Babbage, as they went up during a time when universities honored people who had given their lives rather than a mere hunk of freshly minted cash to the institution. And then I'm going to read a little bit about the campus. How many of you were in the campus? What kind of crowd do we have? Yeah. Kind of thought so. All right. Okay. For a long time, I considered my life story one of a charmed kid who had been able to write novels, play the piano, compose, make movies, and even earn a little fame before he reached his teens, but then threw it all in a dung heap, started smoking, drinking, and taking drugs, and basically wrecked his future. My father certainly believed this to be the case at the time, and it's true that there was little tangible evidence of growth over the next few years. I quit piano lessons. My few films were unwatchable, stoned-out streams of semi-consciousness that panned to the sun every 15 seconds. And my written output consisted of either graveyard poetry or first drafts of horrid, pretentious stories with characters named Rex Valve and Rosetta Stone. In retrospect, I take a more charitable view of those years. For all the mistakes I made in my late teens, and they were considerable, I now believe that they were also inevitable if I was ever to take any baby steps towards authenticity. Slowly, I became less walled within myself, more willing to give and take, more cognizant of human values. If I was still stuck in parallel play, at least I was sitting closer to my playmates. From 1970 to 1975, the 3 years during which I was ostensibly finishing Edwin O. Smith High School, and then for another 2 thereafter, I spent most of my days in the campus restaurant, which stood directly across the street from the school, a perfect place to cut a class, or, for that matter, a whole day of them. It was run by a pair of brothers, Henry and Ed Wong, and had occupied most of a large, windowless basement in the center of stores since 1956. You could show up at 8 in the morning, buy a cup of coffee, and then read, talk, or play chess until the restaurant closed at 8:45. People lived there. The campus restaurant was the epicenter of Stores Hip, an outpost of Cambridge and Berkeley. It was the place where visiting counterculture dignitaries from Jean Genet to Leonard Cohen were brought when they came through town, where demonstrations were plotted, where lecherous old professors came to grope stone college girls through their filmy blouses. In addition to the top hits, the jukebox had singles by Nat Adderley, Miles Davis, Nina Simone, as well as Jefferson Airplane, Country Joe and the Fish, and several short-lived local bands. The bulletin board was a forum for extracurricular activity, keeping everyone informed of the latest astral doings of Sri Chinmoy, Guru Maharaji, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and the perfect masters of Ekankar, as well as 57 varieties of leftism. Anyone in search of a support group for physically challenged third world vegetarian internationalist lesbians for Christ in stores would do well to start the quest at the campus restaurant. Each September, neatly groomed new UConn faculty members and their families would descend the front stairs and pay what usually wound up as their one and only visit to the spot. On the landing, through a haze of cigarette smoke, they would survey the scene, gloomy long hairs with walrus mustaches and bleary eyes staring up from Penguin Modern Classics, teens shaking the pinball machines until they tilted, unleashed dogs wandering from table to table in clear defiance of Connecticut Health Department regulations, sometimes urinating on poles or legs, and then the family would quickly pivot around and walk up and out. Merely to be sighted entering the campus restaurant enhanced one's local notoriety. The place was thoroughly clique-ridden, with an internal pecking order that might have flummoxed the most seasoned New York maitre d'. Longtime patrons had their own section. It was unmarked, but everybody knew where it was, and to sit there without prompt invitation qualified as a shocking faux pas. The brothers kept a snarling German shepherd named Fritz behind the counter, and every now and then Eddie Wong would take a violent dislike to a customer and throw him out bodily. There was no table service. You placed your order at the counter and one of the Wongs would call out when your food was ready, either by the dish you had ordered, grilled cheese on rye, or if you'd really arrived, by your name. An elite few even had house accounts. One year, part of the exterior sign broke off and drivers by on Route 195 must have been startled that anybody would think to open an establishment with the unappetizing name Puss Restaurant. But the Wongs seemed in no hurry to fix the matter, and it entertained the regulars who began calling the place the Puss. Few customers would have made extravagant claims for the food anyway. One friend went so far as to bring his own lunch from home every day to eat it unmolested at a central table, and the coffee was variously likened to grease or motor oil. When the campus finally closed in the autumn of 1977 to be replaced by a hamburger chain, which traded in its graffiti canal wooden tables for bright red formica, even the lofty Hartford Courant took notice. Therese Carmel's article ran under the headline, "Closing of Restaurant Ends Way of Life." She described the campus as a meeting place, a message center, a lending library, cafe, music and game room, and classroom. Diana Lee, identified as a UConn drama student, volunteered that it was, quote, "the only place where freaks could go and feel welcome." All in all, it was the strangest establishment I ever knew, and the one to which I would most like to return, with the stipulation that I could flee the moment that I wanted to. Most of the customers thrived on their misery. Quote, "I can remember awful raw November days when I was completely bummed out and I spent most of the afternoon here with other bummed out people," one patron told Carmel. And I was no exception as I sat there for hours, watching the campus fill up and empty, playing Tom Rush's recording of Urge for Going again and again on the jukebox. The campus was a place to kill time, strike poses, to wallow in confusion, while, as the poet John Berryman put it, quote, "waiting for fame to descend with his scarlet mantle and tell us who we were." A couple of decades on, there would be a great deal of fuss made over so-called political correctness. I grew suspicious of the term, for it seemed to imply that simple human respect for people with different backgrounds was somehow a trendy and repressive fad. And yet I confess that I grew terribly tired of the reflexive radicalism I found in the counterculture. By the early 1970s, the Friday film series, that longtime sanctuary for Store's intellectuals, where I had received my indoctrination into Bergman and Truffaut, was suddenly filled with brats who snickered through love scenes, mocked any character in a uniform, and called out snide would-be witticism throughout the program. It was horrible, and I stopped attending if anything more serious than duck soup was being shown. Moreover, I'd become friends with one of the UConn police officers, a sweet, wily, funny black man named Chip Jenkins. He could belt out soul ballad with the best of them. We would sometimes improvise blues songs together, and it enraged me to hear him called a pig. Fundamentalism of any stripe, religious, aesthetic, or political, had been abhorrent to me, and there came a time where I felt that the politics were entering a Puritan orbit. At an outdoor party, I succumbed to the silent entreaties of a friendly lop-eared puppy and broke off a piece of my hamburger. "Oh no!" a woman shouted from across the yard. "You gave him meat?" I admitted as much. "How could you? He's a vegetarian!" I hadn't realized that there was such a thing, nor, I suspect, had the dog, who is now licking his chops and watching me intently, tail wagging like a windshield wiper. Let's see, where shall we go now? Well, that's actually basically it about the campus. It goes on, it talks all about my own struggle with Asperger's syndrome, which was diagnosed when I was 45. It tries to sum up a little bit about what went on in this town during those days, and it goes on a little bit into what happened to me afterwards. But it's mainly a memoir. I was annoyed by the caption they put on this, and here I'll finish with the preface to this edition. It is now almost 2 years since I scribbled down the final words of Parallel Play at a window table in my favorite Baltimore bar. Initial jubilation was followed by some premonition about the reception that this most personal of my books might receive from friends, family, colleagues, and strangers who would now know more about me than I would ever be likely to learn about them. To my relief, the response has been overwhelmingly open-hearted. Any number of long-time personal associations have been clarified and deepened, and I was grateful to find readers comfortable enough to laugh along with my more spectacular moments of teen bravura. Since the publication of Parallel Play, I have few secrets that require upkeep. I probably feel as home in the world as I ever will, and the past is the past. For this edition, the book's original hastily appended subtitle, Growing Up with Undiagnosed Asperger's, has been dropped, as it seemed to suggest that Parallel Play was a sort of guidebook or owner's manual for people with autism, something better found elsewhere. Instead, I hope the reader will accept this as a quirky memoir that could just as easily have been subtitled Old Records and Silent Movies, Eastern Connecticut in the 1960s, or, to borrow a line from the Three Stooges, Loco Boy Makes Good. My condition will quickly become apparent, but as a friend of mine likes to say, when you've met one person with autism, well, you've met one person with autism. We are a diverse lot, and there are many stories to tell. I've tried to tell mine. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, and now I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll be signing some books. It's just very good to have you all here. I'm seeing more and more faces that I recognize. It sometimes takes me a little while because I'm rather nearsighted. Anyway, I hope you'll enjoy the book, and I hope you'll feel that to some extent I've done some of our past up correctly, some of the good times, some of the not so good times, and in any event, I hope you like the book. And any questions I can answer? A sequel. If somebody asks, I'll certainly do a sequel if somebody asks me to. It's funny because I thought I was going to go on a lot later into my life, but when I got to the section about moving down to New York, it suddenly felt like the book was done. I was supposed to write about 70, 80,000 words. I managed to squeak out 50,000, and I was just sitting, as I say, in this bar one afternoon, and I just wrote down some words, and I just thought, well, the book's done. I mean, I just don't have much else to tell. And I might go back into it. I have to say, writing a memoir is really exhausting. I might do it, but I really don't find the rest of my life as interesting as the first part. I think a lot of people sometimes feel that way. It's just, that's a time when all sorts of stuff is going on, and you're finding it unusual, and you're learning all sorts of things and making all sorts of mistakes. I'm still making mistakes and still learning some things, but I don't know. I might get to it. Steve.
I had read the article in the New Yorker. How did that morph into the book? What? Because that really was about Asperger's.
Yeah, it was. That was something that I had been talking about with David Remnick, who runs the New Yorker, for a good long time. And I had actually, going through one of my broke periods, thought, well, maybe I can write an article about Asperger's syndrome. And I wrote him a note, and I got a very nice response. He said, but we never ever, pay in advance for personal stories. And I thought, well, I need to make some money. And I wasn't sure I could do it, so I didn't do it. And then about 3 years later, I just got a call, and he asked me if I would continue to work on it, and said, if you'll work on it, I'll hold your hand. I'll do anything you can. I promise you, we'll get through this book. And so I wrote it, and the article is really kind of a bombshell. I mean, all of a sudden I was hearing from everybody. I was getting calls from agents and literally thousands of emails. And so they asked me if I'd write a book about it, and I didn't really want to write a self-help book, and I really didn't think that Asperger's syndrome was my whole story. So I said, I'm happy to write a book, and we talked with various people, and some people wanted something very much more purely Aspergerian, and I mean, but I didn't want to write that book, and so I finally found some people who let me write the book I wanted, and then added the subtitle to make it the book they wanted, and so that's sort of how it came out. But it was a strange time writing that article, because I mean, it was very strange when I was diagnosed when I was 45, because I mean we're all better at some things than others, but I was really, really good at a few things, like a tiny bit of things, and really hopeless at most other things. And it was interesting to finally sort of have some kind of explanation for why that was, and why things that I thought I'd quote unquote gotten over, or I'd grown out of, were in fact not grown out of, so that's sort of why I wrote it. And I figure, I mean, my attitude was, I'm now in my mid-50s. If any of my experience is good for anybody else, that makes me happy, because I can't be embarrassed for that much longer, I saw another hand, I thought. Maybe not. Well, we can all talk at the signing or over at the gathering, and